Hello everybody, I am Jmulls of Jmulls Gaming. So the Elden Ring DLC has been quite controversial lately, not because of Shadow of the Erdtree itself, but because of the Game Awards decision to put it in categories like Game of the Year and treat it like a full game. This has caused some controversy as the Game Awards is generally seen as the big gaming award show, despite it not being the only one, and people are upset at the idea of a DLC taking the spot away from another full game or taking the spotlight away from the other full game nominees, or ones that could have potentially been there. And I'm going to start off with, yes, I did vote for it in yesterday's video, but only because, well, let's be honest, if it wins it would be really funny. But I think this serves as a good time to talk about DLC, downloadable content in general, and its weird place in modern gaming. Normally when you say DLC, people imagine an add-on, something extra that goes alongside the base game that is supposed to add to the experience, something like new maps, maybe a new mode, or maybe a short new story. But when you look at gaming on the whole, I think that definition gets a bit murky, as we've seen other terms spring about or gain popularity, such as expansion pass. Not a new thing, especially when it comes to the world of MMORPGs, massively multiplayer online role-playing games, like World of Warcraft or Final Fantasy XIV, where every couple of years or so, a new expansion pass is released with a whole host of new content for existing and new players to dive into. Normally it has hours of new story, new classes, new zones, maybe new mechanics, and is seen as a new era for the game. It seems a bit silly to lump all DLC together in the same category, like a map pack of old from the glory days of Call of Duty or Halo cannot be compared to an expansion pass for an MMO. The value proposition and just everything in it is all different with different goals. No one in their right mind would try and compare, say, a DLC that contains a few new costumes or so to, say, DLC that's just a few hours of content in comparison to the base game to a full release. But every now and then there are things people would view as DLCs that offer more than would be expected for a DLC. MMO expansions are one, as we covered, and now let's get into it. Elden Ring Shadow of the Erdtree is another. It's a monster of a DLC, easily clocking 30 to 40 hours or more depending upon how you play, which is comparable to a lot of other games, with a new world for the DLC, with new gameplay elements, new bosses, new quests. It is a big experience, and while I don't view it to be perfect or anywhere close to without faults, the value proposition on offer with Shadow of the Erdtree is hard to overstate. At the end of the day, people en masse just want a good time. They want an engaging experience, and the terminology you package that up with is secondary to that. Sure, Shadow of the Erdtree is technically a DLC, it's an expansion or whatever you just want to call it, but the amount of new content on offer is comparable to a lot of other full-fledged releases. And would it really be any different if Shadow of the Erdtree was accessible through its own main menu, or if you retooled some numbers around and made it a separate release? Like, yeah, it is part of the story that takes place near the end of the game and uses your character from the base game, but if you decouple the game from that and sold it as its own thing, would that truly be enough for people to classify it as a full game, that in their eyes is eligible for rewards? Because to me, that feels kind of arbitrary. And if we want to argue overall impact, Shadow of the Erdtree and Elden Ring on the whole absolutely left its mark and was widely popular. If they made it so you could buy Shadow of the Erdtree for $40 by itself, and you create a character, have it auto-level to say 110, you pick your stat allocation, and you're dropped off in the Land of Shadow, credits roll after the final boss, would that be enough to consider it a full game? Because again, that doesn't feel quite right to me. It's an interesting situation because it's a problem that only really exists for rewards. And come award season, most people would just say, oh yeah, 7 Rebirth was my game of the year, or, oh yeah, cool, well mine was Metaphor ReFantazio. Well, personally I'm a big fan of Elden Ring, and I enjoyed its DLC the most. And that would be just the end of the conversation, but since we put stock in awards as a form of either celebration for what came out this year or for bragging rights for a favorite game, we get hung up on these definitions that for most people just don't really matter that much in the moment, when you're actually buying satisfying in playing the game. I think the biggest, most important factor is the inherent quality of the item. If a DLC is so good that it breaks those bonds of a DLC and is talked about as if it's a whole new game, I think that is something to celebrate and something to look at, and I think to some degree Shadow of the Erdtree does tick that box. Personally speaking, for an award show, I would just do a best DLC/expansion pass category, call it a GG, and move on about my day. And I'm still not quite sure why that is in a category, or perhaps if they intend for best ongoing game to check that box, but it doesn't quite cover it since we're comparing a year-long stretch of support for potential live service games compared to just a one-done DLC expansion pass. And even if we do take Shadow of the Erdtree and stack it against the full games that came out this year, while I very much enjoyed it, it wouldn't be my actual game of the year, like I said before. I have my own issues with it. I think the tuning is a bit too difficult in places, and I think we've kind of hit the balance for how fast-paced and hectic these kinds of FromSoft games should go, if not passing that mark with a few encounters. Some of the big locations in the new world feel a bit too bare and sparse compared to how jam-packed the base game was. And for how cool the locations are in Shadow of the Erdtree, like the forest blighted by the frenzied flame, it feels too empty. Though I loved the characters, the story, and quite a few of the bosses, my kill of Bale is really cool to me. Hearing Egon do his thing, having shots in my kill that just looks so cinematic, and then that badass finale I had where Egon died, and right before he fully passed, before he finished his dialogue, I managed to down Bale the Dread, so it was almost as if before the final breath of life could escape his lips, he saw his mortal enemy, his nemesis, be felled to give him a brief sense of closure before the end. The rewards from quite a few of the bosses were rather lackluster. I wish R'Lana's spells and swords were more powerful. The final boss's rewards were woefully underwhelming in my eyes. But despite all of that, I loved Shadow of the Erdtree, and it is one of my favorite gaming experiences this year. It brought in whole new mechanics to Elden Ring, which elevated even the base game to me. It is something to be celebrated, and will be a gaming experience I won't soon forget, nor would I want to. A lot of my boss kills came right down to the wire, like my R'Lana kill. If my animation was delayed by even half a second, I probably would have died, but I managed to get it down, and it felt good. Those are experiences that I remember. It's a great game, and I feel that a lot of the time we let ourselves get caught up in terminology or definitions instead of looking at the practical reality of something. And that is something I've noticed, not just in gaming but everywhere. An over-reliance to definition can obfuscate the true nature of what is being discussed, or nitpicking a specific example and almost using it as a straw man to ignore the larger point being discussed. And how important something genuinely is, I had a significant amount of fun with Shadow of the Erdtree, and I'm not alone with that. And for me, it was only $40 and provided a more full, well-rounded, enriching experience than most other full-priced games. Is that more of a condemnation of those full-priced games, or does that speak more to the quality of FromSoft? I think it's a bit of both, but I tend to favor FromSoft just being that good. They are one of my favorite developers, after all, that provide some of my favorite gaming experiences, and no matter how annoyed at a fight or difficult something might be in their games, I always end up coming back for more. For me, I just personally don't care about murky definitions. I care more about if the thing I'm playing is good, and if it's good enough, I don't mind comparing it to other full games, so long as I enjoyed it enough or was engaged with it enough. Some of my favorite gaming experiences are from MMORPG expansions like World of Warcraft, Mists of Pandaria or Legion, or Final Fantasy XIV Shadowbringers and Endwalker, and I absolutely would stack those experiences up with other full games. My favorite story ever told in a game comes from Final Fantasy XIV Shadowbringers and Endwalker. These stories in these expansions are comparable to full Final Fantasy game stories, and I enjoyed them so much, and trying to keep them to the side as something else or even lesser than a full game because of some obtuse definition just doesn't sit right with me. Now, if you want to argue value and say, well, if I only care about Shadow of the Erdtree, I have to have the base game Elden Ring, so for that hypothetical individual, the asking price is like, what, $80? And if you want to argue value off of that, I mean, sure, okay, but I feel like that specific example isn't entirely realistic. But I do get the inherent logic there. Like I said, I wouldn't call Shadow of the Erdtree my game of the year. I voted for it because I thought it was funny, and by God, do we need a little comedy right now. My actual game of the year for 2024 will likely be either Final Fantasy VII Rebirth or Metaphor ReFantazio. But if someone enjoyed Shadow of the Erdtree enough, or enjoyed an MMO expansion, like The War Within or Dawntrail enough, or just enjoyed anything enough, I don't see why that would be excluded from the conversation. I care about the quality of the thing rather than some definition attached to it. And if enough people would call Shadow of the Erdtree their game of the year, then I don't see why that should be dismissed. Now, granted, that's not how the Game Awards work. I think, player voting actually counts for like 10% of Game of the Year, or something like that, don't quote me on that. Like, that's a whole separate other argument, but the point remains. Let's assume it was fully 100% popular vote. If the majority voted for Shadow of the Erdtree, well, that says something else, doesn't it? And my view is, if the industry doesn't want a DLC to win Game of the Year, then make better games. Funnily enough, I actually don't think that applies to this year. I think there's been a golden year of gaming. There's been so many great experiences. Black Myth Wukong, Astrobot, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, Metaphor ReFantazio, Persona 3 Reload, Stellar Blade, Wuthering Waves, great games that came out this year. But I personally never subscribed to the idea of shutting the spotlight on something else simply to avoid repetition. I care more about what is the best thing in gaming more than anything. And if enough people voted Shadow of the Erdtree, then I don't think that should be ignored. Or if enough people would vote for Shadow of the Erdtree, I also don't think that should be ignored. I care about what is the best thing. And I think you can make an argument that there is enough of a value proposition from Shadow of the Erdtree that it should be in contention. I personally wouldn't put it there, but if someone else did, I wouldn't be upset about that. My nominees for Game of the Year, if I had to pick a top 5, would probably be something like Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, Metaphor ReFantazio, Black Myth Wukong, Astrobot, and then maybe like Stellar Blade. That would be my pick. But I talked about it before, I think people just put way too much stock in award shows. And like, I get the issue, right? Because personally, again, like I said before, I think the smarter play here for them would have been to just have a separate DLC/expansion pass category and put Erdtree there. But I don't hate the logic that if a DLC or expansion pass is that good, has that much swagger to it, I don't see the problem with putting it up against the other full games. Again, if it's that good. And if the industry gets upset about that, well then, make better games. There is one counter-argument to this, though, that I do think holds water that I want to talk about. That is the inherent nature that a lot of award shows are just popularity contests, and there's almost certainly a bunch of great indie games or smaller games out there that did come out that do deserve some spotlight, and an award show like this could put spotlight on them. I think that is a genuine good point. My retort to that would be award shows kind of always a popularity contest, like by nature, because how do you objectively define what the best game is? That's a whole other can of worms. But I think a cool thing we could do, though, going off of this, leave a comment down below with what your favorite game of the year was. Let's shout out some of our favorite games this year. Favorite experiences overall. Was it a DLC? Was it an expansion? Was it a full game? Was it a small indie game that not many people talk about? You a big fan of Metaphor ReFantazio, Rebirth, Astrobot, Stellar Blade, Black Myth Wukong, Elden Ring Shadow of the Erdtree, World of Warcraft The War Within, Final Fantasy XIV Dawntrail, Wuthering Waves, Warcraft 1 and 2 Remaster if you're over the age of 40. Yeah, I picked those up too. Those are pretty good. But let me know. I'd love to hear your thoughts, hear your opinions, and hear your perspectives. Stay safe. Have a great day. Leave a like and subscribe if you liked the video and you want to see more content. Bye-bye, everybody. Until we meet again.